Ever since its release, Pale Rider has left us with one big unanswered question. Who was the mysterious preacher played by Clint Eastwood? But the film did actually offer a lot more hints to the answer than you might think, such as the contents of the preacher's security box, the number of bullet wounds on his back, and what Stockburn sees in his eyes. So once and for all, let's try and finally answer who was the Pale Rider. So to understand how everything pieces together, it's important that we first have all the clues. So Pale Rider begins with a group of innocent prospectors and their families being attacked by henchmen, working on behalf of a greedy mining baron called Coiler Hood, who wants them to vacate their legally owned land in Carbon Canyon so that he can take it for himself. And during their assault on the mining camp, the men kill the dog of a teenage girl called Megan, who lives there with her mother Sarah and stepfather Hole. So desperate for deliverance from LaHood and his men, Sarah buries her dog and prays for a miracle, citing a modified version of Psalm 23 that appears to act like an incantation, summoning a nameless stranger on a pale horse from the wilderness. But the next day, the prospectors in camp are already thinking about calling it quits, having lost faith after the attack. However, Hull is one of the few that isn't deterred, and heads into town for supplies, where he becomes the target of LaHood's men. And during the altercation, one of them spots the mysterious rider in the distance, but in the blink of an eye, he vanishes. However, at the moment that Hull needs him the most, the nameless stranger comes to his rescue, dispatching the group of attackers single-handedly, without even breaking a sweat. So afterwards, Hull asks the rider who he is and where he's headed, but he's purposely vague. Despite this, Hull insists that the stranger stay with him and his family. Meanwhile, back at camp, Megan is quoting from the Book of Revelation, specifically the verse that references the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse.
Come and see. And I looked, and behold a pale horse. And his name that sat on him was Death.
Now this appears to be the first major clue of the stranger's origin, heavily suggesting that the preacher is Death himself. However, this is somewhat of a red herring, because in the very next scene, Hole sees the preacher without his shirt on, and spots 6 bullet wounds on his back, suggesting that he is or was a mortal man. Following this, upon hearing what happened in town, Sarah sensibly concludes that their house guest must be a hired gun, and orders Hull to kick him out. But a moment later, their guest walks in wearing a clerical collar. And although he never claims to be a preacher, in the eyes of the family, that's precisely what he becomes, earning their trust in an instant. So the next day, Hull opens up to the preacher that Megan no longer has a father after Sarah's partner walked out on them, leaving Sarah conflicted about the idea of moving on and marrying Hull. And although the preacher doesn't seem all that interested in this at the time, his awareness of this family dynamic proves a lot more pertinent in hindsight. But following this, Coiler Hood's son, Josh, shows up with a giant henchman called Club, telling the preacher to leave or pay the price. However, somehow the unarmed preacher isn't intimidated, even replying with his own thinly veiled threats.
Well, there's a lot of sinners hereabouts. You wouldn't want me to leave before I finish my work, would you?
And when Club is finally sent down to fight the preacher, he only retaliates when he has no choice, and actually shows a lot of consideration to his foe, as if he's somehow already aware that Club is actually a good person, which is proved to be the case later on when he tries to save Megan. So having sent Josh on his way, the preacher tellingly says,
"The Lord certainly does work in mysterious ways."
He then smashes the boulder that they were working on with his hammer, indicating that he might somehow be just as physically strong as a man as big as Club. Either way, the spectating prospectors and us as the audience now know for sure that Clint Eastwood's character is something more than just a preacher. And just like some sort of miracle, all of his theatrics quickly inspire the rest of the camp, just when they are all about to give up. This in turn enrages LaHood, who understands the power a preacher could have.
And a man without spirit is whipped. But a preacher, he could give them faith. Shit. 1 ounce of faith, they'll be dug in deeper than ticks on a hound.
Alongside this, it becomes clear that both Megan and Sarah seem inexplicably drawn to the preacher, while the prospectors finally make a breakthrough finding gold, which wouldn't have happened if not for the motivating influence of the preacher. Following this, in town, LaHood speaks with the preacher, immediately suspicious of whether he really is one.
When I heard a parson had come to town, I had an image of a pale, scrawny, Bible-thumping Easterner with a linen handkerchief and bad lungs.
That's me.
Hardly.
So LaHood proceeds to offer the preacher a brand new church, to which he refuses.
Can't serve God and mammon both. Mammon being money.
So having failed to bribe him, LaHood attempts to intimidate the preacher instead, but suddenly seems to see something in his eyes. So with no other option left, LaHood threatens to call in a killer marshal called Stockburn, but the preacher says that it would be cheaper to buy out the prospectors, directly implying that the pair have already met. This is all but confirmed during the next scene when the prospectors are debating LaHood's offer, as the preacher says,
This is no ordinary kind of marshal. His name is Stockburn. He travels with 6 deputies, and they uphold whatever law pays him the most.
Following this, even the prospectors remark that these are the sort of details that only someone involved with Stockburn would know. But the preacher isn't willing to elaborate, clearly hiding something. Also, that same night, Megan professes her love for the preacher, but he rightly turns her down and refuses to take advantage in a way that someone like Josh would, further establishing himself as a father figure. And the next morning, the preacher watches from his horse to confirm whether Stockburn is really on his way, before vanishing once again, suggesting that somehow he really does have the ability to do so. But this time he doesn't reappear, leaving the mining camp in the lurch, to the disappointment of Sarah and Megan. But it turns out that the preacher left to visit another town, to access a security box in his possession, from which he retrieves 2 pistols, while leaving behind his clerical collar. Following this, the preacher shows up just in time to save Megan from LaHood's men, demonstrating incredibly accurate shooting, only possible from years of practice, or possibly another divine gift. Meanwhile, back at the camp, the departure of the preacher prompts Sarah to admit her feelings for Hull, while one of the prospectors called Spider discovers a large gold nugget, and heads to town to confront LaHood. And this is when we finally get to meet the infamous Stockburn, who despite his reputation, seems alarmed at the mention of a gunslinging preacher, prompting him to ask for a description.
He's tall, lean. His eyes. Yeah, his eyes. Something strange about him.
Following this, Stockburn is shocked to find out that the preacher already knows who he is, and becomes lost in thought, clearly concerned that it might be someone he once knew, before ultimately dismissing it.
Couldn't be. The man I'm thinking about is dead.
Now, as short as this scene is, it's loaded with subtext thanks to the excellent performance of John Russell, as it's clear that whatever Stockburn's relationship was with the preacher, it was significant, emotional, and ultimately ended in death. And chances are it was Stockburn who did the killing, as in the very next scene, he steps outside with his 6 men and toys with Spider, before opening fire, so that Stockburn can step forward to finish him off with a bullet to the head. And this is intended as a message, as Stockburn looks to Spider's sons and says,
Tell that preacher to meet me here tomorrow morning.
And when the preacher sees the body, he immediately recognizes that it's Stockburn's doing. So the prospectors finally demand an explanation of how they know each other. But instead of answering them, the preacher just looks across the prospectors fondly, praises them for standing up to LaHood, and implores them to continue to do so. And in reference to Spider, he says,
Got a brave man there. Give him a decent burial.
Now at first, this might seem like the preacher is once again deflecting questions about his past, but for a man of very few words and emotions, he seems oddly affected by the death of Spider, suggesting that he wasn't actually talking about Spider, but rather himself, subtly answering the prospectors' questions without them even realizing. Either way, the preacher knows he now has to confront Stockburn, but the night before he leaves, Sarah confesses her love to him with a kiss goodbye, realizing after the preacher disappeared that she actually needs a good man like Hull, who won't run away from her like her husband. So following this, the preacher tells Hull to look after Sarah and Megan, before leaving for his fateful showdown with Stockburn. But as he rides through town, Stockburn struggles to make out his face, as the preacher goes to get some coffee and sits down with his back to the door. And despite it obviously being a trap, LaHood's men barge inside to ambush him. But the preacher instantly teleports out of harm's way, all but proving that he's supernatural, as he proceeds to pick off Stockburn's men with ease. The preacher then appears appears before Stockburn and fearlessly walks towards him. But it's only once he gets close enough to see his eyes that Stockburn realizes that this preacher is the one he knew, somehow back from the dead. The preacher then outdraws Stockburn, firing 6 bullets into him, before drawing his second gun to finish him off with a bullet to the head. Meanwhile, Hull comes to the rescue to put an end to LaHood, and with the villains dead, the preacher rides off as abruptly as he arrived, seemingly disappearing into the wilderness, leaving us with a whole lot of unanswered questions. So with all that context out of the way, we can finally answer the big burning question of who was the preacher, because he was indeed a ghost, as confirmed by Clint Eastwood, who in a rare interview said,
"He's a reincarnation of a preacher who was killed by the force of evil, the marshal in the story."
So with this being the case, how do all the pieces fit together? Well, my interpretation is that although the main character presents himself as a preacher, at some point in his past he was also a gunslinger, and a talented one at that, possibly an outlaw or maybe even one of Stockburn's marshals. But the fact that he already had guns stored away in a lockbox would suggest that they were from a past life, one that he likely turned his back on and locked away before he died. And it would seem that during this period, he managed to become part of a community, similar to the Prospectors, hence why he's so keen to protect and help them throughout the film. However, it would seem that the key difference between the two communities is that when the preacher's people were put under pressure, they fell apart and failed to rally together, which is why he tries so hard to inspire the Prospectors, and is touched when he sees that they want to stand their ground, and even have his back. And the reason this is so meaningful for the preacher is that the last time he was in this situation, it was him that had to be the brave man, and stand up to the threat they faced alone, just like Spider. Hence why he seems so taken back upon seeing his body, and why he insists that he's given a proper burial, because Stockburn was responsible for killing the preacher in his past life, and he seems uncharacteristically sensitive about the topic for a cold-blooded hired killer, implying that there was some deeper personal relationship between him and the preacher. But regardless, it would seem Stockburn ultimately killed him anyway, most likely ordering his 6 men to open fire, each putting a bullet in the preacher. However, sometime later, when Megan prays to God for help, he listens, and sends the preacher to help, a capable holy man with good intentions that has a score to settle with Stockburn and his men. And this time around, the odds are in the preacher's favour, because as a ghost, he's imbued with incredible strength, agility, and the ability to vanish at a moment's notice, as well as having no fear of death. So when Megan quotes the Book of Revelation and sees the preacher at the window, this wasn't necessarily a confirmation that he was death himself, but rather that he's returned from it, and intends to raise hell on those persecuting the innocent. And as the preacher hinted, like the Lord, he works in mysterious ways, always showing up when he's needed the most, and standing back whenever it's beneficial for others. And when it becomes clear that there's no other option than bloodshed to stop Stockburn, the preacher returns to a town that he presumably once had a life in, and accesses his old lockbox, retrieving 2 guns that once belonged to him, while putting away his clerical collar, ready to enact his divine retribution. So on reflection, the villains of the movie never really stood a chance against the preacher, and LaHood actually seemed somewhat aware of this, because after he fails to bribe, threaten and bargain with the preacher, he realizes there's something not quite right about him. Stockburn, however, simply refused to admit that the preacher could be the same one from his past, reiterating to himself that the man he once knew was dead, while allowing skepticism and fear to blind him to the truth. And it was only once the preacher got close enough for him to see his eyes that he was no longer able to deny that he was in fact facing a ghost, hence his sheer terror. So in this moment, the infamous hired killer is undone, too flustered to draw quickly enough, allowing the preacher to put 6 bullets in Stockburn, in the exact same pattern that they were put in him. But the preacher then draws the second gun from his lockbox that he has yet to fire, a weapon that clearly has an untold story behind it, that is likely the key to whatever happened between him and Stockburn, hence why he uses it to shoot him in the head, avenging his own death and Spider's. And with the deed done, the preacher immediately looks to leave, for his unfinished business is now complete, meaning it's time for him to return to the afterlife in peace. However, just before he leaves, Hall recognizes the pattern of bullet wounds on Stockburn's body, and turns to the preacher in realization of the fact that he really is a man back from the dead. Now, this is by no means the confirmed explanation of Pale Rider, but rather a speculative theory based on what Clint Eastwood has confirmed himself. Because the truth is that the beauty of the film is that it's ambiguous enough to allow you to make up your own theories, that are just as valid, with popular ones being that the preacher might be an angel, Sarah's dead husband, or even the stranger from High Plains Drifter. So let me know below, who do you think the preacher was, and were there any clues that you think I missed? Also, you might enjoy this video here, where I try to answer who was the stranger in High Plains Drifter.